Rebecca Hayes had been working as a curator at the Chicago Historical Society for nearly 15 years, and she thought she had seen everything. Boxes of forgotten photographs, yellowed documents, faded letters, they all told stories of a city that had grown from muddy streets into towering steel and glass. But on a cold January morning in 2024, as she sorted through a recent donation from an estate sale in the South Side, something caught her eye that would change everything she thought she knew about Chicago's history. The photograph was tucked between layers of newspaper from 1905, wrapped carefully in brown paper, as if someone had intended to preserve it forever. The image showed a wedding couple, a young man in a dark suit standing rigid beside a woman in a high-collared white dress, her expression serious, almost melancholic. Behind them, a handful of guests posed stiffly for the camera, their faces blurred slightly by the long exposure times common in that era. The studio's painted backdrop suggested formality and tradition, but something about the scene felt wrong. Rebecca held the photograph up to the light streaming through her office window. The studio backdrop was typical of the period. Painted columns and draped fabric meant to suggest wealth and sophistication. But something about the image felt different, unsettling even. There was a tension in the couple's posture, a stiffness that went beyond the formality of early 20th century photography. The groom's jaw was clenched tight, and the bride's knuckles appeared white where her hands gripped each other. Their eyes held something Rebecca had seen in other historical photographs from turbulent times: fear. She placed the photograph on her desk and reached for her digital scanner. Modern technology had revolutionized the work of historians like Rebecca. High-resolution scanning could reveal details invisible to the naked eye: scratches, notations, even objects hidden in shadow or beneath layers of time. She carefully positioned the photograph and started the scan, the machine humming softly in the quiet room as it captured every detail of the century-old image. As the image appeared on her computer screen, Rebecca leaned forward, adjusting the contrast and brightness with practiced movements. The faces of the couple came into sharper focus. The groom had dark eyes and a strong jawline, his expression unreadable but intense, as if he were bracing himself for something. The bride looked younger, perhaps 19 or 20, with delicate features and hands clasped tightly in front of her waist. Her eyes seemed to hold a mixture of fear and determination, emotions that transcended the limitations of early photography. Then Rebecca zoomed in on the lower portion of the photograph, examining the floor beneath the couple's feet with growing curiosity. Her breath caught in her throat. There, partially obscured by the bride's long dress and the shadow it cast, lay a small metallic object that clearly didn't belong. Rebecca adjusted the digital enhancement settings, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard with the efficiency born of years of experience. The object on the floor slowly came into sharper definition with each adjustment she made. It was circular, no larger than a silver dollar, with what appeared to be raised lettering around its perimeter and some kind of emblem or symbol in the center. She zoomed in closer, her eyes narrowing as she tried to decipher the details through the limitations of century-old photography and the shadows that partially concealed it. The metal surface caught the studio lights in a way that suggested it had fallen recently. There was a brightness to it, a sheen that indicated it hadn't been lying there long when the photograph was taken. The way light reflected off its surface suggested polished metal, something that had been worn with pride before it fell. Rebecca felt a familiar tingle of excitement running down her spine, the same sensation she experienced whenever a historical mystery began to unfold before her eyes, when the past reached across time with its secrets. She reached for her reference books, pulling down a thick volume on labor history in early Chicago from the shelf behind her desk. Something about the time frame, 1905, resonated in her memory, a half-remembered lecture from graduate school or an article she had read years ago about violence and upheaval in the city's streets. She flipped through pages of photographs showing street scenes, protests, and workers gathered in angry crowds, their faces defiant against the camera's lens. Then she found it. A chapter titled, "The Teamsters Strike of 1905, Chicago's Bloodiest Labor Conflict." Rebecca read quickly, her pulse quickening with each paragraph, her historian's mind already making connections. From April through July of that year, Chicago had been transformed into a battlefield unlike anything the city had seen since the Haymarket Affair. The United Brotherhood of Teamsters had joined a sympathy strike supporting garment workers at Montgomery Ward, and the city's employers had responded with unprecedented violence that shocked even hardened observers. 21 people died in street clashes. Over 400 were injured in daily riots that turned entire neighborhoods into war zones. The newspapers had called it a class war, and they weren't exaggerating. Employers armed strikebreakers with Winchester rifles. Workers fought back with rocks, clubs, and whatever weapons they could find. The police, aligned with business interests, beat strikers without mercy. Rebecca looked back at the photograph on her screen, her mind racing with possibilities. April 1905. The timing aligned perfectly with the beginning of the strike. She zoomed in again on the metallic object, adjusting the contrast and sharpness until the details became clearer. Now she could see it more distinctly. The circular shape, the deliberate design, the way it had been crafted to be worn proudly on a lapel or chest. It was definitely a badge of some kind. Dr. Robert Patterson taught labor history at Northwestern University, and his office looked exactly as Rebecca had imagined when she called him that afternoon. Shelves crammed with books from floor to ceiling, walls covered with historical photographs of strikes and protests, and stacks of papers competing for space on every available surface. He was a legend in his field, having published definitive works on Chicago's labor movement. He studied the enhanced photograph through a magnifying glass, his weathered hands steady despite his 70 years, his gray eyebrows drawing together in concentration as he examined every detail. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, not looking up from the image spread across his cluttered desk. "Do you see this marking here? The distinctive design around the edge?" He pointed with a trembling finger to a section of the badge Rebecca had struggled to interpret. "This is a Teamsters local badge. Specifically, I believe this is from Local 710, one of the most militant groups during the 1905 strike. They were based on the South Side, primarily Irish and German immigrants who worked the stockyards and freight routes. These men were fearless, and they paid dearly for it." Rebecca leaned forward, her notebook open and pen ready. "Can you tell me more about what was happening in April 1905? Why would someone have this badge at a wedding?" Dr. Patterson set down the magnifying glass and walked slowly to a filing cabinet, his knees creaking with arthritis that came from decades of bending over archives. He pulled out a folder stuffed with yellowed newspaper clippings, handling them with the reverence of sacred texts, each one a fragment of forgotten history. The 1905 strike began in December 1904 when garment workers at Montgomery Ward walked out over union representation. But it exploded in early April when the Teamsters joined in sympathy. That's when the real violence started, when Chicago became a killing ground. He spread several newspapers across his desk, pushing aside books to make room. The headlines screamed of chaos in bold typeface. "Blood in the streets. Teamsters clash with police. 20 injured in Southside riot." Rebecca read accounts of rocks thrown through windows, gunfire exchanged on busy streets, men beaten in broad daylight while crowds watched in horror. "The Employers Association armed strikebreakers with Winchester rifles," Dr. Patterson continued, his voice heavy with old anger that hadn't diminished over decades of study. "They recruited men from other cities, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, even as far as New York, promised them wages far above what workers normally made, and gave them weapons. They told them to shoot anyone who interfered with deliveries. The city became a war zone that spring. Mayor Dunn couldn't control it, or wouldn't." The next morning, Rebecca stood outside Kowalski Photography Studio on Milwaukee Avenue, one of the few businesses from 1905 that still existed in any form, though now under different ownership and catering to modern digital photography. The building itself looked ancient, its brick facade weathered by more than a century of Chicago winters, the mortar crumbling in places, the windows replaced multiple times but still maintaining their original proportions. A small bell chimed as she pushed open the heavy wooden door, its brass handle worn smooth by countless hands. Inside, the current owner, Thomas Kowalski, great-grandson of the original founder, greeted her warmly. He was a man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands stained with developing chemicals. He still practiced traditional photography alongside the digital work. "Dr. Patterson called ahead," he said, gesturing toward a back room with enthusiasm. "Said you were looking for records from 1905. I'm excited someone's finally interested in the old days. My family's history is locked in those books." The storage room was cramped and dusty, filled with boxes stacked to the ceiling in precarious towers. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and something indefinable that spoke of age. Thomas pulled down a leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle with age, the binding cracked but still intact. "My great-grandfather kept meticulous records," he explained with obvious pride. "Every photograph, every client, every payment. He was German, very precise about documentation. He believed that photographs were historical documents, not just family mementos." Rebecca's hands trembled as she opened the ledger, scanning the entries for April 1905. The handwriting was elegant but faded, written in iron gall ink that had turned brown with time. Each line recorded a name, date, and type of photograph. Weddings, family portraits, memorial photographs of the deceased, all documented in neat columns with German efficiency. Then, halfway down the page for April 14th, she found it. "Wedding photograph, Joseph Novak and Anna Kowalski. Payment received, $350. Emergency session, late evening." Kowalski, Rebecca said, looking up at Thomas with growing excitement. Same surname as your family? Thomas nodded slowly, his expression changing. It was a common Polish name in this neighborhood back then. But wait, Anna Kowalski married someone named Novak? He pulled out another box from a high shelf, this one containing old family records, letters, and photographs. My great-grandfather had a sister named Anna. She disappeared from family records around 1905. My grandmother said she married against the family's wishes, and they cut her off completely. The family never spoke of her again, as if she had died. Rebecca spent the next 3 days buried in the Chicago Public Library's archives, surrounded by microfilm readers and boxes of historical documents that smelled of preservation chemicals and forgotten time. The cramped research room on the third floor smelled of old paper and the particular mustiness that came from century-old newsprint. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she scrolled through page after page of newspapers, her eyes straining from hours of reading small print on glowing screens. The Chicago Tribune from April 1905 painted a picture of a city descending into chaos and violence. Each day brought new headlines about the Teamsters' strike, each more alarming than the last. On April 7th, riots erupted when Montgomery Ward attempted to move goods using strikebreakers protected by armed guards. 1,000 striking workers and their sympathizers attacked the wagons on Union Street, overwhelming the guards. 3 men were shot in the melee. 5 more were beaten so badly they required hospitalization. On April 29th, another clash left 2 dead and 5 critically injured, their names listed in small print at the bottom of the article. But it was a small article from April 15th, 1905, one day after the wedding photograph, that made Rebecca's hands freeze on the microfilm advance knob, her breath catching in her throat. The headline read, "Union Organizer Vanishes After Southside Violence." Her heart pounded as she leaned closer to the screen, reading every word carefully. The article was brief, only 3 paragraphs buried on page 7 between advertisements for patent medicines and department store sales. A man identified as Joseph Novak, age 27, described as a known Teamsters organizer and agitator, had disappeared following a confrontation near the stockyards. Witnesses reported seeing him pursued by several men wielding clubs and shouting threats. His wife, recently married according to public records, had filed a missing person report with the police. The investigation had yielded nothing. Police claimed no witnesses would come forward, though the article suggested witnesses were too frightened to speak. Rebecca printed the article with shaking hands and immediately began searching for more references to Joseph Novak. Over the next 2 hours, she found 3 more mentions scattered across different newspapers. One, in an editorial from the Tribune, described him as an agitator and troublemaker who inflames honest workers with radical ideas. Another, from a pro-labor newspaper called The Worker's Voice, painted him as a hero of the working class, fearless in his dedication to justice and dignity for all who labor. The contrast in descriptions revealed the deep divide splitting Chicago in two. The third article, dated May 3, 1905, reported that Joseph Novak's body had been pulled from the Chicago River near the Harrison Street Bridge by workers unloading a freight boat. The official cause of death was listed as drowning, but the article noted suspicious circumstances and injuries consistent with a severe beating prior to entering the water. Rebecca's next breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a dusty box of immigration and naturalization records she had requested from the National Archives facility in Chicago. While searching through citizenship applications from the 1940s, she discovered a 1942 naturalization document for Anna Novak, who had become a United States citizen at age 57, decades after arriving as a child from Poland. The document listed her as a widow and included an address in Bridgeport, a working-class neighborhood on the south side that had housed generations of immigrant families. Property records showed the house had remained in the family for 3 generations, passing from Anna to her daughter to her granddaughter. After several phone calls and a careful explanation of her research, Rebecca found herself standing on the porch of a modest brick home on a tree-lined street, being greeted by an elderly woman named Helen, Anna's granddaughter, who was now in her 70s but still had her grandmother's sharp eyes. "My grandmother died in 1968, Helen said, leading Rebecca into a living room filled with old furniture covered in embroidered doilies and family photographs that spanned a century. But she talked about her husband until the very end. She never remarried, you know. Said Joseph was the only man she ever loved, that no one could replace him. She kept his memory alive for 63 years. Helen disappeared into a bedroom and returned carrying a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling, the brass hinges tarnished, but still functional. Grandma kept this hidden for years in the back of her closet. She only showed it to me a few months before she died. Said someone needed to know the truth, that history shouldn't be allowed to bury Joseph's story. She made me promise to keep it safe. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, written in a careful hand on yellowed paper that crackled when touched. Rebecca's breath caught as she began to read, her hands trembling with the weight of touching something so intimate and precious. They were love letters from Joseph to Anna, written during their brief courtship in early 1905, filled with declarations of devotion and dreams of a future together. But mixed among the romantic words were references to the cause, to dangerous work, and to men who would silence us forever if they knew. One letter, dated March 1905, was particularly revealing, and Rebecca read it twice to absorb its full meaning. "My dearest Anna," it began, "I must tell you something that may change your heart toward me, and I will understand if it does. I am not merely a teamster driving wagons. I have been working secretly with the union organizers, gathering information about the Employers Association's plans." Helen brought out more documents from her grandmother's collection. Newspaper clippings Anna had saved meticulously over the years, carefully pressed between sheets of waxed paper to preserve them, each one chosen for a specific reason. Most were about the strike and its violence, but several caught Rebecca's attention immediately. They described the Employers Association of Chicago, a powerful coalition of business owners formed specifically in 1902 to crush the union movement that had been growing steadily since the 1890s. The association represented Montgomery Ward, Sears Roebuck, Marshall Fields, and dozens of other major companies. "Grandma told me her Joseph was trying to infiltrate the strikebreakers," Helen said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the danger from 1905 still lingered in the air. "He would dress as one of them, hide his union sympathies, listen to their plans in saloons and meeting halls, and report back to the union leaders. It was incredibly dangerous work. If they had discovered him, they would have killed him immediately without hesitation." Rebecca examined a photograph Helen had pulled from the box. It showed a group of roughly 20 men standing in front of Montgomery Ward's massive building, all armed with rifles that gleamed in the sunlight. Their faces were hard, showing no mercy or compassion. "These are the strikebreakers," Helen explained, pointing to individual faces. "Grandma said Joseph recognized some of them as criminals recruited from St. Louis and other cities. Men with records of violence, men who enjoyed hurting others. The Employers Association promised them $5 a day, a fortune then, when workers made less than $2, plus weapons and legal protection if they killed any strikers. They were given immunity." The pieces were falling into place, but questions remained that nagged at Rebecca's mind. She looked again at the wedding photograph on her laptop, now understanding the tension in the couple's faces with new clarity. The fear in their eyes wasn't about marriage. It was about survival. "The badge on the floor," she said. "Do you know why it would be there? Why would Joseph risk wearing it to his own wedding?" Helen nodded slowly, her eyes distant as she recalled her grandmother's words. "Grandma said they were supposed to have a quiet wedding, just the two of them and a few trusted friends from the union. They chose evenings specifically to avoid attention, but someone followed them to the studio, an informant or a spy. Right before the photographer took the picture, a man burst in demanding to know if Joseph Novak was there. Joseph had been wearing his badge under his coat as a symbol of pride, but in the confusion and panic, it fell when he reached for Anna to protect her. Rebecca contacted the Chicago Police Department's Historical Records Division, requesting any files related to Joseph Novak's death investigation. The bureaucracy moved slowly, and she'd almost given up hope when, 3 weeks later, a package arrived. A manila folder containing the original 1905 investigation reports, handwritten in fountain pen on yellowing paper that smelled of must and age. The handwriting was sometimes difficult to decipher. The ink faded, but the content was explosive. The detective assigned to the case, a man named Patrick O'Brien, had been more thorough than Rebecca expected, interviewing dozens of witnesses in the days following Joseph's disappearance. Most claimed to have seen nothing, their statements brief and clearly fearful, words chosen carefully to avoid saying too much. The fear came through even in century-old police reports. But one witness, a grocery store owner named Otto Brenner who had emigrated from Germany, had provided a detailed account that filled 3 pages with careful observations. Brenner described seeing 4 men, well-dressed in suits and bowler hats rather than working-class clothes, carrying clubs concealed under their coats, chase Joseph Novak through an alley near Halsted Street on the evening of April 15th. When Novak fell after tripping on garbage, they surrounded him and beat him savagely, their clubs rising and falling with systematic brutality while shouting about union scum and troublemakers getting what they deserve. Brenner had watched from his store window, too terrified to intervene, knowing he could be next. Most importantly, Brenner had identified one of the attackers as James Thorne, son of one of Montgomery Ward's co-founders, and himself a prominent leader in the Employers Association. Thorne was known throughout Chicago's business community as a hardliner who believed unions should be destroyed by any means necessary. But when detectives attempted to question Thorne about the incident, they were blocked by an army of lawyers and political connections reaching into the mayor's office and beyond. The investigation stalled within days, then quietly closed without charges. Rebecca cross-referenced Thorne's name with other historical records and found something striking that made her pulse quicken. In testimony given during a 1906 grand jury investigation into the strike's violence, several witnesses had mentioned a special squad of enforcers hired by the Employers Association. These men, recruited from as far as Pittsburgh and St. Louis, were given the specific task of identifying and neutralizing union organizers. The testimony suggested this squad operated with police knowledge and protection, making them effectively immune to prosecution for their crimes. A photograph from the Chicago History Museum's collection showed Thorne standing with a group of stern-faced men in an alley, all holding rifles casually. The caption identified them simply as security personnel, hired to protect Montgomery Ward property during labor unrest. The answer to who had betrayed Joseph came from an unexpected source, a baptismal record from St. Adalbert's Catholic Church dated March 1906, nearly a year after Joseph's death. It listed the parents as Anna Novak and father deceased, and the child's name as Catherine Miller Novak. The unusual middle name caught Rebecca's attention immediately. The godfather was listed as Carl Miller, described in the church records as Anna's brother, and a foreman at Montgomery Ward's shipping department. The choice of godfather seemed strange given the circumstances, unless there was a deeper story. Rebecca felt ice run through her veins as connections formed in her mind. Carl Miller, K. Miller. She remembered a notation she had seen in the Employers Association ledger, a payment to K. Miller for information about union activities. Anna's own brother had betrayed Joseph to the Employers Association, selling information that led directly to his murder. The middle name was either a cruel irony, or perhaps Anna's way of ensuring the betrayal was documented somewhere, even if only she understood its significance. She called Helen immediately, her hands shaking as she dialed. "Did your grandmother have a brother named Carl? This is extremely important." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds, and Rebecca could hear Helen's breathing, ragged with emotion. "She never spoke of him. Not once in all the years I knew her," Helen finally said. "But my mother once mentioned that Grandma had a brother who worked as a foreman at Montgomery Ward. They never reconciled after something terrible happened. Mom didn't know what, and Grandma refused to discuss it. She would leave the room if his name was mentioned." Rebecca arranged to meet Helen again the next day, this time bringing copies of all the documents she had found. As they sat in Helen's living room, Rebecca explained the trail of evidence pointing to Carl Miller's betrayal, the payment records, the timing, the access he would have had to information about union members. Helen listened, tears streaming down her weathered face, her hands trembling as she looked at the documents spread across her coffee table. "Grandma must have known," Helen whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of understanding. "She must have lived with that knowledge for 60 years, watching her daughter grow up never knowing her father because her uncle had him killed. That Catherine's middle name. It was her way of remembering, of marking the betrayal in a permanent record." Rebecca pulled out one final document, a letter she had found in the Chicago Historical Society's collections, donated anonymously in 1968, the year of Anna's death. Someone had sent it after her passing, perhaps fulfilling a final wish. It was addressed to Carl Miller and dated June 1905, written in Anna's careful hand, the ink slightly smeared as if tears had fallen on the paper as she wrote. 6 months later, Rebecca stood before a crowd of more than 200 people at the Chicago Historical Society for the opening of a new exhibition titled Courage and Betrayal: The Untold Stories of the 1905 Teamsters' Strike. The gallery had been transformed, its walls covered with photographs, documents, and artifacts that brought that violent spring back to life. At the center of the exhibition, mounted under special lighting and climate-controlled glass, hung the wedding photograph, now professionally restored and enlarged to 4 feet wide, with the Union badge on the floor clearly visible to everyone who looked. Next to it, Rebecca had arranged a detailed timeline of Joseph Novak's life. His immigration from Bohemia at age 12 with his parents, fleeing poverty and limited opportunities, his work as a teamster driving freight wagons through Chicago's streets, his secret activities as a union organizer gathering intelligence on the Employers Association, and his murder at 27, killed for believing workers deserved dignity and fair treatment. Letters between Joseph and Anna were displayed in glass cases, their words testament to a love that transcended fear and danger. The exhibit included photographs of the strike's violence, copies of newspaper accounts from both pro-business and pro-labor publications, and the damning evidence of Carl Miller's betrayal, documented in the Employers Association's own records. But most importantly, Rebecca had tracked down living descendants of Joseph and Anna through genealogical records and family trees. Helen stood beside her, surrounded by cousins and relatives who had never known their connection to this history, who had grown up with family stories that omitted crucial chapters. Many wept as they learned about their ancestors' courage, his willingness to risk everything for principles larger than himself. Some had brought their children and grandchildren, wanting them to understand where they came from. Dr. Patterson, who had helped Rebecca throughout the investigation, spoke to the assembled crowd in a voice that carried the weight of decades studying labor history. Joseph Novak represents thousands of forgotten workers who risked everything for dignity and justice, he said, his words resonating through the gallery. The 1905 strike failed, the unions were broken, public support collapsed, and men like Joseph died without recognition. But their sacrifice planted seeds that would eventually bloom. 25 years later, during the Great Depression, Chicago's workers would rise again with the CIO and finally win the rights Joseph fought for. The 8-hour day, safe working conditions, fair wages, the right to organize without fear. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed to examine the exhibits more closely, Rebecca returned to the photograph one last time. She looked at Joseph's face, no longer seeing just a groom at his wedding, but understanding the full weight he carried that evening. The knowledge that he was marked for death, the determination to fight anyway despite the danger, the love for Anna that made him hope for a future he somehow knew he would never see.